Hey guys, today we're going to talk about why no Americans trust each other and why none of us trust our government. That's the topic for today, and I want to get into it. So let's start out with the big guy, Donald Trump himself. When I look at President Trump's actions so far, what stands out most is that his approach across nearly every major issue is built around the speed, control, and the disruption of existing systems. Supporters see this as decisive leadership, and critics see it as destabilizing. But regardless of their political opinions, where you fall politically, these actions have real consequences for everyday people, and that's what we need to focus on. On immigration, Trump has doubled down on enforcement first policies. His administration has expanded border security measures and increased deportations as priorities. He tightened the asylum standards and reinstated and expanded travel restrictions from the certain regions. Trump argues this protects national security and reduces the strain of public services and restores respect for immigration law. For everyday Americans, this affects labor markets and the housing demand, school systems and local budgets, and especially the broader states and major cities. What we should demand here is honesty. Border security matters, but it does not serve as a functional legal immigration system that meets labor needs, processes asylum claims, and efficiently treats the people with humanity. I'm sorry, hold on. Oh, treats the people's humanly. Humanely, my bad. Enforcement without reform isn't a solution, and neither is compassion without capacity, so we got to keep that in mind. Now, on the economy, Trump is focused heavily on domestic production and the tariffs and America First trade policies. His administration argues that protecting American manufacturing in some industries, this can be job protection and investments for consumers. It can also mean higher prices on everyday goods when tariffs raise costs. The real issue for working class families is affordability. Groceries, rent, the health care, and energy. And what we should demand is economic policy that protects workers without quietly shifting costs onto consumers. On energy and environmental policies, Trump has pushed deregulation and expanded fossil fuel production. He also argues this lowers energy costs, strengthens energy independence, and protects the job in oil, gas, and mining. Lower fuel prices do help families and businesses, but reduces environmental protections also. It raises concerns about air quality, water safety, and long-term public health. What we should be demanding isn't an all-or-nothing approach. It's transparency, accountability, and investment. You know, the transparency he promised when he was being elected. Both energy and efficient affordability and environmental protection, including innovation and transition planning for the workers. And foreign policy, Trump has emphasized strength and deterrence on over diplomacy, most notably through aggressive action and threats indeed, to protect U.S. dominance. The supporters see this as a restoring America's credibility, and the critics warn it risks escalation and international backlash. For everyday Americans, the foreign policy affects the gas prices and the military deployments, global stability, and where tax dollars go. What we should demand is clarity, clear goals, and the clear limits of congressional oversight with the military force is involved. On government and bureaucracy, Trump has moved up to cut regulations and shrink the federal agencies and reduce what he described as the deep state influences. As he argues, this makes government more efficient and less intrusive. The concern is that cutting oversight can weaken protections in the consumers and workers and public health. What we should demand is the reform that improves accountability and the efficiency without hollowing out our institutions that has protected the public. Not that there isn't waste, fraud, and abuse, but we should be careful on how it is done. There should be a process. Across all this, one thing is consistent: the polarization is growing and trust in the institutions continue to erode. Trump's style energizes supporters but alienates others, and when politics becomes a constant state of conflict, everyday people feel exhausted, unheard, and uncertain. The exhaustion is dangerous because the disengagement doesn't stop policy, it just removes the public's influence. So we do? What should us people do? Us civilians. We should demand the transparency first and foremost. Over slogan solutions or over outrage and policies that acknowledge trade-offs instead of pretending they don't exist. We should stay informed and challenge misinformation and hold leaders accountable regardless of the party. And most importantly, we should remember that these issues aren't theoretical. They shape our cost of living, our communities, and our future. This isn't just about blind support for the automatic opposition. It's about understanding what's being done, how it affects our lives, and refusing to let fatigue replace the engagement. Like, that's just, they want to keep tiring us out and just be over everything. And to build on that, it's important to understand that the present approach of Trump isn't just about individual policies. It's about how power is exercised and justified. Across immigration and the economy, energy and foreign affairs, and his administration consistently frames decisions as necessary corrections to the system. He argues with failing ordinary Americans. That framing resonates with many people who feel left behind, but it raises a critical question. We should be asking as citizens, necessary according to whom and with what safeguards? Now, for instance, let's take immigration. Again, because this is where the gap between rhetoric and reality often hits hardest, Trump's position is that the strong border restores fairness and rule of law. And for Americans who feel systems are being exploited or overwhelmed, that message lands. But for everyday people, especially in local communities, the lack of a parallel investment in immigration, the courts, work visa expansion, and the infrastructure means the pressure doesn't disappear, it only shifts. What we should be demanding is just enforcement, but a system that actually works from end to end, so chaos isn't the permanent state of the affairs like we're seeing right now. On the economy, Trump often points out its markets, jobs, numbers, and domestic production as proof that its approach benefits workers. Now, for some Americans, especially in energy and manufacturing regions, those gains feel real. But for others, the day-to-day reality is still rising costs, unstable housing, and the financial anxiety. That's why we should demand policies that measure success, not just growth. At the top, but by affordability and stability for families trying to plan their futures. When it comes to the energy and deregulation, Trump messages are clear. Cheaper energy equals economic relief, and in the short term, lower fuel and utility costs do no matter for working, environmental decisions, water quality, air pollution, health risks, and disaster response. What we should be demanding is the balance of affordability now without sacrificing health and safety later. Now, in foreign policy, Trump's emphasis on strength is meant to deter adversaries and protect confidence. That approach appeals to Americans who are tired of the long wars and unclear of objectives. But the strength without transparency creates uncertainty, and uncertainty affects military families, the taxpayers, and global stability. What we should be demanding is clarity on goals, limited in accountability, because foreign policy decisions don't just affect other countries, they affect American lives. All of these feeds into deeper issues. Trust. January and the early months of this administration have shown that trust is fragile, and once lost, it is difficult to rebuild. When people feel that the policies are being imposed rather than explained, or when outcomes don't match the promises, the skepticism will continue to grow. The skepticism doesn't make someone unpatriotic, it just makes them attentive. So, as viewers, as citizens, our role isn't just cheer blindly to reject automatically. Our role is to ask hard questions, demand evidence, and push for solutions that reflect reality rather than slogans. We should assist by staying informed, supporting credible local and national efforts which address the housing, labor shortages, and the healthcare access and immigration reform, and by holding leaders accountable for results, no intentions. At the end of the day, the President Trump actions will continue to shape the direction of the country, but how those actions ultimately affect our lives depends on whether we remain engaged or we retreat into exhaustion. If there is one thing I want you to take from this discussion, it is this. The issues we're facing are complex, but the disengagement only makes them harder to solve. Staying informed, demanding transparency, and participating where we can is how we are the people keep our seat at the table, because the future isn't just being decided in offices and press briefings. It's being shaped by how much we are willing to pay attention and speak up about the issues. To wrap everything up, here's let's get into this real quick on the economy. Trump's emphasis on domestic productions and tariffs and the America First trade policies is meant to protect workers and strengthen independence. For some regions and industries, that has real benefits. But for many families, the biggest issue remains the affordability: food, rent, healthcare, energy, and policy. The successes should be measured by whether people can realistically plan their lives, not just by market indicators. We should be demanding economic policies that protect workers without quietly making the cost of living. The cost of living. Energy and deregulations follow the same pattern, and Trump argues that fewer regulations mean lower costs and more jobs in the short term. That can be relief. But everyday Americans who live with the long-term consequences of environmental decisions and the air quality, it should be balance, transparency, and, as Trump ran on, accountability. In foreign policy, Trump's preferences for strength and diplomacy is meant to deter adversaries and resort to U.S. power. The supporters see their confidence, critics see risk. For everyday people, foreign policy affects fuel prices and the military families, the global stability and how tax dollars are spent, and the oversight, because strength without accountability creates uncertainty. So oversight is like necessity. Across all of these runs a deeper issue: trust. Trust is government trust in institutions, and that decisions are being made with public in mind and not just political advantage. When policies are rushed, framed, or emergencies are explained through conflict rather than clarity, the trust erodes. And when people lose trust, they disengage. Not because they don't care, but because they are exhausted. They're tired of being treated like little kids. And me personally, they treat us like we're too stupid to understand what they deal with. So what's our role in all this? It's not blind support, and it's not automatic opposition. Our responsibility as citizens is to stay informed and ask the hard questions, demanding transparency and push for solutions that acknowledge trade-offs instead of pretending they don't exist. We assist by engaging logically, holding leaders accountable, and regardless of party, refusing to let outrage or fatigue replace our understanding. At the end of the day, President Trump's actions will continue to shape the direction of this country, but how those actions affect our lives depends on whatever we the people remain engaged. The issues we're facing are complex, but disengagement only gives power more room to move with consent. Staying informed, paying attention, and speaking up is how we protect our seat at the table, because the future isn't just being decided in Washington. It's being shaped by how much we are willing to stay involved. What we're witnessing right now is an unprecedented level of tension between civilians and political systems. Sorry about that. Not just in the United States, but across the entire Western countries, and that the combination is combustible. Trust in our institutions has collapsed, and when trust collapses, people stop seeing their neighbors and as fellow citizens and start seeing them as our enemies. One of the biggest drivers in political fragmentation, traditional parties no longer represent broad coalitions, but instead power has fractured into smaller, louder factions that thrive on outrage rather than governance. Social media accelerates this by rewarding most extreme voices, not the most accurate or thoughtful ones. But when politics becomes identity instead of the policy, compromise is no longer seen as cooperation, it's seen as a betrayal. Okay. Economic pressures makes this worse. Housing costs, wage stagnation, healthcare access, and job insecurity are pushing people into survival mode. When people feel they are losing ground while others appear to be gauging special treatment, resentment grows. That resentment doesn't safely focus on systems, it gets redirected at groups of people, which is exactly how polarization becomes a hostility. Cultural change is another accelerant. We see this all over, especially in Europe. Western societies are changing rapidly due to globalization, immigration, and shifting social norms. For some people, this feels like progress. For others, it feels like a loss. When governments fail to openly acknowledge those fears, or worse, they dismiss them altogether, people look for an alternative narratives that validate their frustration. Extremism movements exploit the vacuum. Now we have to talk clearly and honestly about the extremism because there are threats, but they are often misunderstood or misrepresented. For instance, the elephant in the room, Islamic extremists. Ideology is a real and documented threat just as it has been for decades. It is rooted in the radical political interpretation of Islam that seeks to impose religious law through coercion or violence. These ideologies are not representative of Islam as a religion or Muslims as people. Most Muslims in America are law-abiding citizens who want safe opportunities and freedom just like everybody else. Conflating extremists within entire communities is not only wrong, it actively helps extremists by feeding the grievance narrative. At the same time, domestic extremism, including white supremacists, accelerationists, and anti-government militias, currently accounts for about a significant portion of extremist violence in Western countries. These groups often frame themselves as defenders of a culture while actively undermining the constitutional order, rule of law, and civil peace. Now, the extremism does not come from one religion or one ideology. It emerges whether grievance meets radicalization regarding claims that Muslims are trying to improve or implement their way of life, destroy American culture. This is where precision matters. In the United States, no religious group has the legal authority to impose religious law, and attempts to do so would violate the Constitution and be blocked by the courts. What doesn't happen is cultural friction. Different values and norms and practices colliding in shared spaces. That friction becomes dangerous only when governments fail to enforce natural laws equally, or when political actors exploit fear instead of managing integration and responsibly. The real issue isn't culture, it's governance. Failure when leaders avoid setting clear expectations about civic law, free speech, women's rights, and secular governance. They create confusion and resentment on the sides of integration without shared civical standards, which doesn't work. Neither does forced assimilation. Successful societies require both freedom of belief and loyalty of our constitutional rules. First, we have to deprioritize the information itself. That means rejecting blanket accusations, verifying claims, and refusing narratives that frame entire groups as enemies. Second, the path forward isn't silence and it isn't rage, it's clarity, fairness, the enforcement of shared rules, and the courage to talk honestly about turning neighbors into enemies. If we want to protect American culture, Western values, and the democratic stability, we have to defend principles, not attack populations. The moment we lose that distinction is the moment extremism of any kind wins. Now, continuing from there, the hardest truth to face is that polarization feeds itself once it reaches a certain point. When people no longer trust institutions, they stop believing that peaceful participation will change anything. That's when frustration hardens into anger and anger becomes justification. At the stage of extremists don't need to recruit aggressively, people drifts towards them because they offer certainty, identity, and someone to blame. This is how tensions move from political disagreement into social fracture. If we don't fix this, the consequences are serious. Social trust continues to erode and the political violence becomes normalized. Governments respond with heavier surveillance and force, which further fuels resentment. Even societies fragment into hostile factions that no longer see themselves as part of a shared nation. History shows leads it to instability of the freedoms that we do have. Now, right there, me personally, I think our government is specifically doing this purposefully to flood our country so we become polarized, which is obvious. We all know this. And these extremists, especially the Islamic extremists, they want their way of life. It's no secret. They scream Allah Akbar and death to America and all that, like from Iran and everything. I wrap them up all in the same bubble. They want to kill anybody who's not Muslim who will not convert to Muslim. We've seen this play out. We've went to war for over 20 some years for this. We've lost our men and women in uniform. God bless them and thank them for their service. Each and every day we should do that. But this is what is going on. And yes, the majority of the Islamic extremists are of a Muslim religion. But not all Muslims are bad, and obviously we can concede that. But these particular ideological ones that, like their religion, I'm not educated on their religion, but from what I hear, I don't worship pedophiles. But moving on from that, so let's not get into too deep to that. First, we have to depolarize information itself. This means rejecting blanket accusations, verifying claims, and refusing narratives that frame entire groups as enemies. Second, governments must restore legitimacy by enforcing laws consistently, secure borders completely, and addressing economic pressure honestly. Third, we need civic re-education teachings that constitutional rights actually mean. We need education so they know what our Constitution means, and they should apply that if they want to come here. Including the limits of freedom of religion, which does not mean freedom to override the civil law. If we don't fix this, the consequences are serious and the social trust continues to erode. Political violence becomes normalized. Governments respond to their heavier surveillance and force, blah, blah, blah. We know that they just want to be more totalitarian and put all these cameras in, and they want digital ID like we're seeing in Europe and everything else. And we can't allow that. If we don't fix this, the consequences are serious. Social trust continues to erode and the political violence becomes normalized, and governments respond with the heavier sanctions. The path forward isn't silence and it isn't rage. It's clarity, fairness, enforcement of shared rules, and courage to talk honestly without turning neighbors into enemies. If we want to protect American culture, Western values, and democratic stability, we have to defend principles, not attack populations. The moment we lose that distinction is the moment we lose against the extremism. The hardest truth to face is that polarization feeds itself once it reaches a certain point. When people no longer trust institutions, they stop believing that peaceful participation will change anything. That's when frustration hardens into anger, and anger becomes justification. At the stage, extremists doesn't need to recruit aggressively. They just drift toward them because of their identity, and they have someone to blame. You know what? I'm going to pause here because I may have. The solution is not targeting communities, it is reasserting shared civical standards and equal enforcement of the law. Protects everyone. Clear boundaries reduce fear when people know the rules apply fairly. Extremist narratives lose oxygen. Weak enforcement, selective tolerance, or political cowardice do the opposite. They convince people the system is rigged. Education also plays a role, but not the way it's often discussed. Civic education has been hollowed out. Many people don't fully understand the constitutional limits, separation of church and state, and how their rights coexist with our responsibilities. That vacuum allows extremists to redefine freedom as dominion and tolerance as surrender. Rebuilding civic literacy is not indoctrination, it's itself defense of our democracy. If we continue down the current path without correction, the risks escalate. Political violence becomes more common, public trust collapses further, government responds with broader surveillance, harsher policing, and reduced civil liberties. Ordinary people who just want a stability and opportunity get squeezed between radical movements and security state. That outcome doesn't preserve freedom, it erodes it. So what can we actually do? Well, we can demand the policies that prioritize integration with accountability, not denial. We can support law enforcement with intelligence agencies and insisting on constitutional limits. We can refuse to amplify false narratives even when they flatter our own fears. And we can push leaders to address the root causes: housing, wages, education, mental health, because extremism feeds on despair more than ideology. Most importantly, we can stop letting extremists define conversations. America and the West more broadly has survived far worse moments than this because it's held on to its core idea. Shared rules, equal rights, and civic loyalty matter more than the tribal identity. If we abandon that idea, division becomes permanent. If we defend tension, still be resolved. If we defend it, tension can still be resolved. The moment is dangerous, but it isn't hopeless. What determines the outcome isn't how loud the extremes get. It's rather the majority stays informed, principled, and engaged. That's the difference between a society that fractures and that corrects course. As I bring this to a close, I want you to understand why I took the time to lay out all of this so clearly. The tensions we're living through right now didn't come out of nowhere, and they aren't being driven by one group, one party, one belief system alone. They are a result of years of broken trust, unmanaged change, economic pressure, and the cultural confusion, and leaders who often choose avoidance to outrage over responsibility. And if we don't acknowledge that, honestly, we can't fix it. What I hope you take from this is what I hope you take from this isn't fear, it's clarity. The extremism, whether foreign-inspired or homegrown, thrives when people feel ignored, powerless, divided. Cultural conflicts grows when laws aren't enforced and equally and expectations aren't clearly defined, and a society's fracture when citizens disengage instead of demanding that better leadership. None of this is inevitable, but all of it becomes permanent if we stop paying attention. The responsibilities now falls to us, not to hate and not to panic, not to turn on our neighbors, but to stay informed and demand accountability. Defend our constitutional principles and refuse to let extremists define who we are. We can protect our culture without abandoning our values. We can enforce our laws without losing our humanity, and we can disagree fiercely without destroying the country we all share. If you walk away with anything today, let it be this: the future of this country doesn't belong to the loudest voices or the most extreme ideologies. It belongs to the informed, the engaged, and the majority who are willing to think critically and act responsibly. Stay aware and stay grounded and stay involved. That's how we keep this moment from becoming a breakthrough point.